My charge is to tell you some stories about the Navy Medical Corps. But really, they're stories about doctors who wore blue and gold and sometimes forest green. It is the birthday of the Medical Corps. Well, it's the time we celebrate the birthday of the Medical Corps, but more on that later. You have a right to know why. I shall let novelist imitating life explain my purpose. In his classic science fiction novel, Double Star, Robert A. Heinlein had his protagonist, Lorenzo Smith, reflect on the values by answering himself the question, what did I live by? My profession, surely. I'd never been impressed by formal schools of ethics. How did I behave? Well, the show must go on. I had always believed that and lived by it. But why must the show go on, seeing that some shows are pretty terrible? Well, because you agreed to do it. Because there's an audience out there, and they've paid, and each one of them is entitled to the best you can give. You owe it to them. You owe it also to the stagehands and managers and producers and other members of the company, and to those who taught you your trade, to others stretching back in history to the open-air theaters and stone seats, even to storytellers squatting in the marketplace. I decided that the notion could be generalized, value for value, building on the square and on the level, the Hippocratic Oath, don't let the team down, honest work for honest pay. Such things do not have to be proved. Heinlein, like many good novelists, grapples in art with things difficult to articulate in life. What is the essence of professionalism? He concludes that a professional has integrity. This professional integrity applies to the knowledge base, know and do the job according to the standards. We might term this expertise. And to doing of the job. Society trusts the members of the profession to apply the knowledge for the benefit of the society, what we might call duty. But if you're not a science fiction fan, perhaps another novel provides some insight. In his spy thriller, Patriot Games, the late Tom Clancy had his hero, Jack Ryan, and his wife, Dr. Kathy Ryan, visit the Tower of London, where the guards, retired non-commissioned officers from Britain's elite military units, demonstrate a traditional ceremony. A retired sergeant major of the Paras explained, tradition is important for the soldier. Tradition is often the reason one carries on when there are so many reasons not to. It's more than just yourself, more than just your mates. But it's not just something for soldiers, is it? It is true, or should be true, of any professional community. It is, Kathy Ryan said. Any good medical school beats that into your head. While I hope this is less painful than beating it into your head, instilling some of that important professional tradition is my primary goal. In order to understand the Medical Corps, we must understand the United States Navy. That Navy emerged out of the British Royal Navy traditions while we were still colonies. The Royal Navy was engaged in worldwide operations to shape Britain's colonial empire. The 18th century was a time of almost ceaseless war. The great battles that shaped those wars were fought by men in ships of war that came in a variety of sizes. Large ones to fight other ships of the line, usually in definitive battles, and smaller ones to chase commerce, to cruise to see what was happening. Britain staffed the ships with sailors from the merchant marine, recruited under a system called impressment, where trained seamen could be essentially drafted into the Navy in time of emergency. The system was subject to considerable abuse. On the ships, care was provided by the surgeon or the surgeon's mate, not a university-trained physician, but a tradesman trained in apprentice fashion. But as the Navy began to spread activities around the world, and the sailors and ships were away from port, surgeons led by John Woodall began to think about the need to do more than surgery. And Woodall's, the surgeon's mate, taught medicine as well as surgery. In 1740, George Anson left Britain with a small fleet to circumnavigate the globe and capture the Manila Galleon to help pay for the War of Austrian Succession. He managed it, but it took 3 years, and he lost the vast majority of his crews, few to enemy action, the overwhelming majority to disease, and the principal disease was scurvy. Scurvy today is a deficiency of vitamin C, but in the 18th century, its cause was unknown, and the symptoms suggested it was a multivitamin deficiency. But old wounds opened, broken bones became unhealed, and the teeth fell out. In 1746, James Lind, aboard His Majesty's ship Salisbury, conducted an experiment in which he tried a variety of remedies for scurvy. It turns out to be the first controlled clinical trial documented in medical history. He was looking primarily at what we would call acid-base balance, and his assumption was there was a deficiency of acid foods. The report is only a handful of pages in a large monograph that he published after the war was over. He dedicated it to George Anson on the argument that fleet commanders should understand what caused the loss of their sailors. After a brief period of peace, another European war broke out, this one called the 7 Years' War. We know it as the French and Indian Wars in the United States. It started with the French attacking the island of Minorca and the Mediterranean fleet under Admiral John Byng, responsible for defending it. Under the sailing instructions of the day, Admiral Byng was not supposed to attack a fleet larger than his own, where the prospect of success was vanishingly small. And so he let the French take the island from the British. The public was incensed, in part reflecting the political climate. Admiral Byng asked for a court-martial. He honestly expected to be exonerated because he had obeyed all the regulations. However, the court found him guilty. His guilt was based on a failure to do his utmost. This was a new standard of officership. The job is to get the job done. And when Byng was executed on his own quarterdeck, it focused everyone's attention on the awesome responsibility that came with commission status. George Anson was made the First Lord of the Admiralty, and he knew he had to do something. So he took a successful subordinate, Edward Hawke, and gave him the Channel Fleet. And he put James Lind in charge of Haslar Naval Hospital. Between them, they would craft an understanding that the recruitment or impressment of new sailors required special considerations. They would be initially isolated and given new clothing, the origin of issuing the ratings uniform. Hawke entered close blockade of the French coast, and the fleet was replenished underway to meet Lind's requirements for a balanced or at least nutritious diet. At Quiberon Bay, Hawke defeated the French in one of the great demonstrations of British naval superiority. He reported back that because of the underway replenishment and Lind's hygienic changes, that only one man was sick after almost a year of his flagship at sea. Clearly, Lind's system of vegetables in the diet and underway replenishment would allow close blockade as a successful strategic approach to naval operations. But then as now, change was difficult. Surprising no one, everybody looked for a cheaper way to do it. There must be a better way. It can't be the whole story. This is too hard. Well, the war is over. Maybe we'll just worry about it later. By the time the British Navy was recruiting for the American Revolution, most of the people involved in Hawke's success were retired and declined to support the effort. The United States became an independent country, and we began our own naval tradition. I have not yet begun to fight still rings in the training of officers. After the war, all the ships that had been involved were paid off. But in 1794, new ships were laid down for the commercial war with France. That quasi-war didn't go very well, but it didn't last very long. The small navy would become devolved in defending commerce, particularly in the Mediterranean, where the fleet from Britain was fighting the Napoleonic Wars on the Barbary coast states began to prey on commerce. During that campaign, the USS Philadelphia ran aground in Tripoli Harbor and was taken by the enemy. Leaving the most effective weapon system in the theater in enemy hands was not long considered as an operational choice, and so Stephen Decatur would lead what we would call a special operations mission to destroy the Philadelphia. As he recruited volunteers, his surgeon, Lewis Herman, offered to go. But Decatur replied he couldn't afford to take a surgeon. If he lost him, there was no replacement. Herman argued that he was an officer and that his presence would improve the operational effectiveness of the force. Decatur took him, the Philadelphia was destroyed, and Herman went on to a successful naval career, setting a standard of going into harm's way with those he was responsible to care for. A few years later, we entered our own war with Britain, the War of 1812, in part as a result of British interference with commerce and the impressment of Americans in their war with France. This is a war that attributes much to the myth of naval invincibility. The Constitution renamed Old Ironsides, the Shannon versus the Chesapeake, and Don't Give Up the Ship. These single ship actions, important as they are to heritage, were not a strategic success. And by 1813, American shipping was largely blockaded in American ports. The Navy could not support a national strategy of freedom of the seas, but operationally it would support other objectives. On the Great Lakes, the story of the Chesapeake and its captain's Don't Give Up the Ship was taken up by Oliver Hazard Perry to encourage his sailors as they made possible the Army's invasion of Canada by restricted naval shipping on the Great Lakes. Perry sailed out to meet the British in his flagship, the Lawrence, with one surgeon, Usher Parsons. The other surgeons assigned to the fleet reported sick as they departed from the port. As the battle raged, Parsons took over the wardroom as a cockpit to treat the injured. He noted that many of the injured, with an all-hands call to repel boarders, left his care to fight the ship, knowing that if the ship was taken, they were unlikely to be well cared for. Perry was forced to transfer his flag. Parsons continued to treat his wounded, only stopping bleeding and doing what was necessary to keep the sailors alive, providing definitive care on shore the next day. Parsons wrote up his accounts, and it's clear that first and foremost we remember Usher Parsons because he went to sea when his duty called. He also had a plan that fit the tactical situation at sea, recognizing the triage and primary care afloat is confined to the realities of keeping the ship afloat. This tradition continues in our Navy. Military medical systems of evacuation and resupply have to be modified at sea because of the isolation of the ship. As late as the 1990s, when the USS Stark was hit in the Persian Gulf by an Exocet missile, managing wounded on the ship with an eye towards the needs of the ship would still be doctrine. The United States survived the Second Revolution, and the Navy began to patrol the Caribbean, controlling pirates as well as the Mediterranean, protecting commerce. Naval hospitals were established to care for the people ashore, and in the 1830s, Surgeon Thomas Harris at Philadelphia Navy Yard established the first school to teach naval medicine. In 1842, the Bureau of Medicine was established as part of a general reconstruction of the Navy Department. In 1846, we would find ourselves at war with Mexico because of our sense of manifest destiny, that the United States would control the entire continent from ocean to ocean. The Navy was charged with blockading the Mexican coast. Vastly superior in ships and guns, it didn't have much trouble defeating the Mexicans, but it did have trouble with scurvy. Jonathan Foltz, surgeon to the USS Raritan, urged his captain to resupply with fresh fruits and vegetables before joining the blockade. Other surgeons did the same thing, but the line officers declined. Over 2/3 of the ships would have to sail to Pensacola to hospitalize large portions of their crews. British and French observers criticized the U.S. Navy for its lack of knowledge of blockade action, and George Bancroft, acting Secretary of the Navy, ordered a relative rank and sick reporting to be made by naval surgeons in order that captains could not ignore their advice to preserve the health of the crew without possible central oversight. The next war would also be a war of blockade. It would also be a civil war. There were occasional landing actions like New Orleans and later along the Atlantic coast. But the primary Navy fighting was on the Mississippi with gunboats, soon to be ironclad gunboats. In 1862, the Sanitary Commission made available a captured steamer renamed the Red Rover as a hospital ship. The Secretary sent Ninian Pinckney to Ohio to take command. But he went by way of the recent Battle of Antietam to learn about the care of the wounded. Arriving after the battle, he talked with Jonathan Letterman about the needs of care and evacuation, as well as long-term definitive hospitalization. He recruited the Sisters of Charity to serve as nurses on the new hospital ship, and so assured quality care as the patients were transported. He insisted that the hospital ship sail with the squadrons along the Mississippi to take off the wounded and to resupply medical stores. The other kind of naval action was cruiser warfare, mostly chasing down blockade runners. Among the most famous is the Kearsarge sinking the Alabama. On the Kearsarge, the surgeon, J.M. Brown, had prepared the crew by teaching them to care and evacuate the wounded so that he could care for them under a controlled location. But he noted in his log that in the heat of battle, all his teaching was forgotten, and no officer had reinforced it. By the middle of the 19th century, the need for officership to be a member of the ship's company and to contribute to the staff work that prepared for battle was becoming increasingly specific and increasingly pressing as the Navy developed larger and larger global responsibility, and there was naval medicine to learn, and it could be learned before you were promoted from assistant surgeon to full surgeon. This brings us back to the question of the birthday and the Navy Medical Corps. We've seen that surgeons were present from the beginning and that BUMAD was established in 1842. But the chief of the Bureau was not called the Surgeon General until the Navy Bill of March 3, 1871. And the Medical Corps is mentioned, and so the Medical Corps retrospectively defines this as its birthday. It's important to realize that this bill was not about the Medical Corps. It was rather about the relationship of staff and line officers and meeting the increasing complex needs of the Navy. It also reflects a shift in thinking about the more modern medicine of physiology, germ theory, and the rise of hospitals with nursing care. It seems a good birthday, and so we celebrate it at this time. In law, the doctor at sea becomes an officer, and now is explicitly assuming the naval officer tradition, the obligation to do your utmost. It is also a time of naval change, the beginning of the steam and steel. In 1889, when Surgeon Brown, nor Commodore Brown, was Surgeon General, the nation began to lay down its own steel ships. He was concerned about livability, safety, and health. There were problems with moving patients in a steel ship, getting them out of turrets, through hatches, up and down ladders. And the modern surgery required assistance from anesthesia for nursing, and so the baymen began to take on new responsibilities and training. And the environment of the ship is dangerous. Simply working in the engine room, where the temperature was frequently above 100 degrees, would exhaust and debilitate both officers and men. The machinery of steam-powered pistons was open and dangerous. And officers like Albert Gihon began to study what we would call occupational and preventive medicine, recognizing the need for more and more education, both in medicine and in naval operations. It was in light of these needs that Surgeon Charles Siegfried was sent to the relatively new Naval War College, and as additional duty, he began to take classes. As he thought about the operational doctrine for the new Steel Navy, he recognized that after each port of call, there were debilitating gastrointestinal diseases. Siegfried had the idea. It was related to the germs, and so he talked to a fellow officer, Henry Taylor, whose next duty station would be to command the brand new battleship Indiana. Siegfried asked to be the ship's surgeon. The shipboard practice, still based on 18th century predecessors, was to divide the crew into a group of messmates, men that lived and ate together. They reported to the cook and got the food. They prepared it collectively and ate together, untrained in sanitation. Siegfried believed they were passing germs that caused the diarrheal diseases. And so he organized, aboard the Indiana, the first consolidated mess with trained cooks and assistants who knew about germs and that heat destroyed them, and that they needed to ensure that they were not making the crew sick. From that beginning, modern dietary hygiene in the Navy expanded rapidly with training and certification of the new rating of cook. It was simply one of many examples of platform-specific preventive medicine, or as we would say today, force health protection. The germ theory was also improving surgery and patient care. And when the war with Spain came in 1898, Victoria's fleet would have some wounded, the Spanish would have many. They planned to transfer them back to the hospital ship Solus. The challenge of moving them, both within the ship because of the hatches and ladders, and from ship to ship, led to a 20-year discussion of the best way to manage movement of the wounded. It continued until Surgeon Charles Stokes came up with the idea of a splint litter, later called the Stokes, and still a core feature of emergency preparedness and management. In 1916, when the United States entered the European War, most of the naval action had already been completed. But young naval physicians like Joel Boone would accompany the large number of United States Marines. They were supplementing Army efforts in the American Expeditionary Force. A surgeon to the 6th Marines, Boone would rush into no man's land and rescue wounded Marines, bringing them back to his aid station. For this, he would receive the Distinguished Service Cross. On another occasion, he took a motorcycle with sidecar through the high explosives and gas to bring supplies forward. For this, he would receive the Medal of Honor. He probably has more hero medals than any medical officer in the service. But among the most important things he did was train his corpsmen to follow the new French practice of being seconded to an operational unit, to provide care at the point of wounding. Because of this effort, would become standard practice in the Marine Corps. Boone would be the last Medical Corps Medal of Honor winner in any service. And in the adjacent regiment, the first corpsman would win the Medal of Honor for doing much the same thing that Dr. Boone had been doing, establishing a new tradition, corpsman up. After the end of World War I, as the Marines looked at the possibilities of the amphibious mission, Boone in the White House as the first presidential physician, along with William Mann, working at Quantico, would develop doctrine to support Marine light infantry. Taking off from the 19th century tradition of corpsmen ashore, the corpsmen of World War II would accompany the Marines on Tarawa, would help evacuate them into combat receiving ships on Guadalcanal and other islands, and finally would join the Medical Corps in staffing the casualty receiving ship, landing ship tank hospital, beginning at Iwo Jima. The Second World War would see the recognition of science, including medical science, and the importance of provision of care, as 40% of America's doctors took care of about 8% of the Americans in uniform. Those physicians who had specialty certification were given higher rank and worked in hospitals, not in the battalions and regiments. They had food, air conditioning, clean sheets, and were far from enemy bullets. At home, the frozen wages led to improved fringe benefits, and Americans became increasingly covered by hospitalization insurance. In 1940, 9% of Americans had hospital insurance. In 1950, 53% were covered. World War II saw another change in the traditions of the Medical Corps, the presence of female reservists in CONUS. The first 3 commissions were for Lieutenant Junior Grade Cornelia Gaskell, Lieutenant Junior Grade Aska Bean, and Lieutenant Commander Hulda Thielander, who put up with discrimination and foolishness to serve their country and care for sailors and Marines. In the post-war, this need to provide care to families, workers, vastly expanded the patient population in naval hospitals. Obstetric wards, rare before the war, became an important line of work. Pediatric dependents from war brides also became important. Fortunately, the Surgeon General, using reserve academics, had planned for the development of graduate medical education in naval hospitals. And as the Congress expanded the dependent and retiree benefits, the Navy was by and large prepared to meet this new duty. The new Defense Department was much less prepared to meet the surprise invasion of South Korea by their northern cousins. While initially Army campaign, the Marines were soon deployed to reinforce the Army along the Pusan perimeter and stop the North Korean advance. They would, at Incheon, land to lead the assault into the north. Joel Boone was sent to look at the utilization of hospital ships. This now 63-year-old admiral recognized that the hospital ships were not able to support the Marines who were ashore more than a few miles. Air Force search and rescue helicopters were being used by the Army, and he postulated that Navy helicopters could bring wounded Marines to hospital ships. Of course, there was no place to land in 1950, so platforms were put beside the hospital ship, and Boone shinnied down a rope to the deck to prove it was possible. The Bureau of Ships would reconfigure the fantails of the hospital ships to make helicopter transport easier going forward. But the proof of concept was a Navy doctor determined to do his utmost. Other Navy physicians backfilled for Army doctors in rear area hospitals where operational knowledge was less critical. This was hardly new, even though the Department of Defense-based collaboration was new. Navy doctors had backfilled as early as the Seminole Wars in Florida in the 1830s. Since they were trying to support Marines, their work at Role 3 and above was no different and freed up Army physicians to work in Role 2 and the new MASH. The support of Marines and their evolving missions had led to great diversity in platform skills of Navy physicians for the Cold War. Of course, the Korean War was not won. An armistice was declared and everybody went home. The Cold War continued. In CONUS, the expansion of residency and the development of hospital medicine, supported by insurance, was growing steadily. In the 1960s, government programs of Medicare and Medicaid expanded the portion of Americans insured, and the expectation of care continued to grow in the military. Medical support of dependents and retirees was expanded by the Champus programs. But the Cold War never stayed cold, and in the 1960s, it heated up in Southeast Asia. The improved helicopter resulted in better evacuation, now from point of wounding, and nowhere in that long, skinny country was more than about a half hour from hospital care. The dust-off approach pioneered by the Army led to an expansion of medical care and transport in the United States. But Marines remained skeptical of the dedicated ambulance helicopter, preferring instead traditions of maximum flexibility. Hospital medicine for the Navy, like the Army, was supported by reservists and resulted in phenomenal subspecialty care, like the work of Captain, later Admiral Kirstein, who developed venous anastomoses for extremity wounds, lessening the long-term damage and the maximum return to duty. Navy medicine, in fact, all of American medicine in Vietnam, was state-of-the-art specialty subspecialty care in phenomenally equipped hospitals. It created an expectation in the military that they would have dedicated specialists, as well as their traditional generalists, to provide excellent operational care. The Marines, with their Strategic Hamlet program, as well as the Army with a large variety of programs, explored humanitarian care of indigenous personnel in what was called a Hearts and Minds campaign. Metrics were generally not available, and there is some indication that the program was approved by the line to give the doctors something to do. The progress of science had improved preventive medicine. Regulars trained in subspecialties had improved psychiatry, surgery, the study of infectious diseases. But operational doctrine, in support of the Marine Corps, constantly changing mission, required further thought through the 1970s. The conversion to an all-volunteer force led to a shortage of physicians and other healthcare providers, and campaigns to build up the reserves went forward with vigor. The cost of medicine continued to go up in the military, was repeatedly asked to justify its number of doctors, their specialties, and their utilizations. In 1983, a quick invasion of Grenada, some Marines and Rangers arrived by helicopter with the expectation that the wounded would evacuate by helicopter to the casualty receiving ships. But the Army helicopter pilots had not been approved to land on Navy ships, and operational security kept the Navy ships and the Army helicopters on different radio frequencies. An operation in Panama saw corpsmen with Navy SEALs stabilize patients for rapid evacuation back to CONUS. A new doctrine of moving stabilized but not stable patients began to be discussed. At the same time, the Assistant Secretary of Defense encouraged the Congress to require more joint activity of the medical department. In keeping with the Goldwater-Nichols Act, Congress was skeptical of Defense's ability to do joint medicine, but the department ran several trials of combined hospitals. American medicine continued to change. More and more people were treated on an outpatient basis, and the population was aging as life expectancy at 65 increased for the first time in human history. This was particularly important to military medicine because the Cold War standing force, which retired every 20 years, produced by the 1990s 2 retirees for every active duty beneficiary in military medicine. President Reagan outspent the USSR, the Berlin Wall came down, President Bush thought there would be a peace dividend and military spending could decline. Military medicine was expected to also decline, but the beneficiary population was not declining at all. And then, in 1991, it turned out the world was not a safe place after all. Saudi Arabia became the staging ground to repel the Iraqis who had occupied Kuwait. Operation Desert Storm did not produce the casualties expected. The large deployment of advanced medical capacities, but fixed facilities, hospital ships, delayed operations, and it was underutilized. The General Accounting Office criticized military medicine for its lack of preparedness, flexibility. New thinking was obviously required. At the same time, President Clinton inherited a set of obligations for operations around the world. Some went better than others. In Mogadishu, things went particularly bad, and a former SEAL who had become an ophthalmologist, Captain Frank Butler, realized something needed to be done to improve forward care. By the late 1990s, he was conceiving a new forward care doctrine, Tactical Combat Casualty Care, TCCC. Its understanding: first, return fire, find a place of security, and then stabilize your patient. Took advantage of emerging thinking in trauma care, but there was a great deal of skepticism. Meanwhile, the Champus program was transformed into TRICARE in an effort to save money and improve care and access. On September 11th, 2001, a new war, a global war on terror, emerged in New York City. The Navy responded in support of civilian activities. Marines would lead the offensive effort in Afghanistan, followed by Operation Iraqi Freedom, as the nation entered a new colonial war. Captain Butler deployed to Afghanistan in 2007 to observe TCCC in a combat theater. A committee was formed to improve TCCC, as well as the Role 2 care in the deployed surgical platoons. Based on the Desert Storm models, the Air Force offered combat casualty evacuation to reduce the Role 3 facilities and theater. While operational changes were playing out, base realignment and closure went forward in the United States. In 2005, Walter Reed was consolidated with Bethesda Naval Hospital. Savings did not immediately appear. And so, Congress felt by 2017 a bit more forceful consolidation. A unified command structure would be necessary. The accountants immediately began to ask whether all the doctors in all the hospitals were needed in deployments. But the critical go-to-war specialties turned out to be very difficult to define. Professional experience and skill in trauma care was difficult to acquire, and specialty arrangements and training programs had to be developed. Skilled activities were rehearsed in platform-specific environments, almost invariably in support of Marines. A system of care, from highly trained combat corpsmen through surgical stabilization, careful critical care evacuation, was developed and implemented, which resulted in the lowest died of wounds rate in history. This system continues to be studied in the Joint Trauma System. Captain Butler retired and returned as a contract physician at Pensacola Naval Hospital and continues to chair the TC3 committee. The Air Force built doctrine around aeromedical evacuation, posited safety of the airways, and the Navy, like the other services, assured the trauma surgeons continue to be trained in trauma teams in hospitals, usually civilian, experiencing a lot of trauma. The Navy, in the support of the Marines, was well prepared. Marine missions and relative roles in combat were constantly changing. In recent years, strategic doctrine has once again focused on peer conflict. The last time the Navy at sea fought a peer was before most of you were born. For damage to ships, we have a policy of damage control. But how to do damage control surgery on sailors to stabilize them and evacuate them to more advanced care is much less clear. The hospital ships of the current fleet are not capable of coming alongside combatants like the Bountiful did in 1945 for the stricken Bunker Hill. Whether older than the country or just 150 like its birthday, the medical corps has work to do. Sir John Hackett, in his Lee Knowles lectures on the profession of arms, define the essence of military life as being prepared to use the ordered application of force under an unlimited liability. Most of you are prepared for the unlimited liability of going into harm's way, but there's also a liability of staff work, of administrative courage, that tells truth to power, that requires thinking about how you have supported the sailor and the Marine who have defended the country. As the 21st century progresses, like those who have gone before, you can only do your utmost. But the country expects that you really will do your utmost. I have been cared for by naval personnel in Navy facilities. The quality of care is exceptional. But in the tradition of the Navy Medical Corps, these stories, I hope, suggest that that is only part of what the American people have come to expect from Navy medicine. A sailor's assurance, American commerce and supply chains are uninterrupted. They go in harm's way. As Marines stand the watch around the globe, they protect us all. They do these things because they know their countrymen will care for them. That is the tradition of Navy medicine, to be the nation's agent, standing in the gap for the wounded sailor and Marine. It requires everyone's utmost expertise and duty.